Hello once again everyone, and welcome to part 13 of my Wharfhead copyright case. This episode is going to be about the summing up of the judge. This article here, 65 paragraphs. Going to go through everyone with you, discuss everyone. How I've set it out, I've put the document on a table to keep it still so we can scroll through each paragraph, and then you can freeze each paragraph as you go along, and then listen to my comments when you open it up again. That's the only way I could do it to keep it at a steady rate doing this video on my own. So let's waste no time now. Let's get into it and let's look at it. And this is going to be probably the last of the videos of my Wharfhead copyright case, but it might be in two sections. I'm not sure how long it is. I think it's quite long. After that, well, I'll do a summing up of what I think of everything, and then I'll push it out on the net and you can have a good look at it and decide what you want to do yourselves, or decide what you think yourselves, and at least you'll know the truth. Okay, let's get on with it. Right, first of all, we've got item 1. The judge goes on to talk about Terry Bond, who was apparently the fella who introduced Ian Jackson to Wolverhampton Wanderers to introduce my logo to the club. Well, what he says was his logo, but it was basically my logo. A couple of questions about his first statement is, if Terry Bond knew all this and was a close friend of Ian Jackson, why did he never come forward in all the years that he knew that Ian Jackson had done the design? It's my opinion that he never saw Ian Jackson do the design. All he did was he introduced Ian Jackson to Harry Marshall in 1979 as a designer that could bring forward some sort of design to the club. Mr. Bond was never questioned on the stand about what I've just spoke about, and Ian Jackson wasn't questioned about him either. All Terry Bond said on the stand was his relationship with the club and how he knew Ian Jackson. So Terry Bond didn't produce any evidence whatsoever that Ian Jackson had done the design. We'll move on now to Article 2. I'm going to scroll this slowly because it's pretty difficult if you're trying to do this all in one. In Article 2, it just goes on to say about the adoption of the logo and the badge and everything to the club, and it's basically more or less true, except for the last paragraph, which obviously I don't agree to, is where it refers to the logo as Mr. Jackson's design. We'll move through these as quickly as we can. Next we have paragraph 3. This paragraph is about Mr. Jonathan Russell, who in 2002 was commissioned to revamp the Wolverhampton Wanderers sign and put a board around it. Now, the strange thing about this Mr. Russell is the uncanny link between my 1963 design, Ian Jackson, who produced the 63 design with just the Wharfhead on the shirt, and then this guy, Mr. Russell, comes up in 2002 and then creates the second phase of my original 1963 design, which was, I thought, adjudicated by the judge in paragraph 9 as belonging to me, and as a genuine design which I designed in 1963. So, first of all, no one's explained this. Mr. Russell, which I spoke about earlier, he said that he got inspiration from the ground. Well, I've already spoke about that, so we won't go over that ground again. But really, what I'm actually saying is that Mr. Russell says that he did the border. Well, this is a photograph of my original designs from '63, authenticated by the judge, and you can see there's a border on that original design. So if the judge says that my 63 designs are original, he's also saying that the border around the warp head of my 63 design is original also. And also, here's a picture of that same design, the Pascal base third phase design, which the painting competition was entered on, and you can see the same border. Now the uncanny thing is here, we start to go into the coincidence. Is it coincidence that Ian Jackson came along to Wolverhampton Wonders, produced my black warp head, and then coincidence that 30, 40 years later, Mr. Russell comes forward and then produces the second half of my design? Now, I find that hard to believe, but the judge seems to believe it. He seems to be a bit gullible, this judge, especially as he accepts the explanation from Mr. Ian Jackson to how he designed my warp head, as that he drew 6 lines with a felt tip pen on a piece of paper, cut them out and joined them together and formed the warp head. And that's Mr. Ian Jackson's explanation of how he designed the warp head for Wolverhampton Wanderers. To me, coincidence is a reaction created from an action, and the action to me is my design of 1963, and the reaction is Ian Jackson and Jonathan Russell copying my design to profit from it. The next article we'll go on to is Article 4, which I would say that Mr. Jackson's is strikingly similar to mine, not mine is strikingly similar to Mr. Jackson's. Then we go to Article 5, and we'll move on to 6, which is top of the page, as you can see, which basically goes on to just explain or narrate the story that I brought forward to Mishcon de Reya. And we've also got 6 and 7 explaining the same thing, which is true, in my opinion. Then we move on to Article 8. This is where the judge authenticates my 1963 design, that I designed it in 1963, well, he says 61, 63, but I designed it in, would have been around about 62, because obviously there was the progression, the 3-stage progression from the Stamp album, which I explained earlier on, to the Cyril Kell poster, and then the Pascal-based idea, which I entered into the painting competition. But by him authenticating my Cyril Kell poster design, he really condones and condemns Ian Jackson and Jonathan Russell. There was, as you can see in that statement there, Mr. Speck, when the judge did look at my design, when I explained in an earlier episode, and the judge saw the date on the design, which I never saw, I mean, I'd probably forgotten about the date, but the judge must have special eyesight, he'd probably be a bit Specsavers, and he pointed it out to this Mr. Speck and his gang of 3, and they were really miffed by it, and the judge's statement forced them to admit it was authentic, but he's tried to throw a little sort of curveball in there, as you can see, which was his style. Right, on to 9. This is just the judge's confirmation that I designed the 1963 warp head logo. He goes on to state about Mr. Jackson's design not being dissimilar to mine, and he goes on to talk about the muzzle, the bottom of the muzzle, mine being slightly rounded and Jackson's being flat. Surely this supports my story about the Pascal design and it being based on a circle, because if you look at the circle design, the bottom of the muzzle is circular, but they try to deny this in later statements, as you see, But there's a slight clue, is the rounded section of the muzzle at the bottom of the warp head, which the judge is pointing out here. Right, we'll move on to 10 now. Now I'm reading I have read these before, but I'm reading them as I go along, so I will be a slight pause, and it gives you a chance to look at it yourselves as well. This is the from the narration that I sent to Mishcom de Raya, the very first people I tried to get on my side. It's just an outlining of how it all came to fruition. So let's move on from 10. It's going to be a bit shaky because this is the way I have to do it. I've got no other way. It finishes off about the gallery and says that I wasn't amongst the winners, which Ian Jackson's statement explains why I wasn't amongst the winners, because he said in his statement that Arthur Evans and Bernard Brett wouldn't have liked my design because it was too straight line for him. It was in the Bauhaus style, and he said to the judge that he loved Bauhaus. So it's pretty obvious what happened after that, and it's to my mind, but obviously not to the judges. Let's move on to 11, and he goes on about how I submitted the design to the painting competition, and obviously a bit of information about the witnesses, Joanne, which is Ron's wife. He also goes on to state about the statement from my wife Jean. She made a statement because I met her in '65 and she'd seen my artwork then, and obviously she was too infirm, as it states here, to come to court. So her witness statement was of no use basically. If you look under the last couple of lines, the judge said it was just admitted under hearsay, which basically means nothing. Oh yeah. Here he goes on to speak about so-called experts such as Mr. David Moore, who runs a historical website. What he doesn't point out in this statement is that even this Mr. David Moore, or no historian, even the historian from Wolverhampton Wonders, hadn't got a clue who designed the Warphead logo till I came forward in 2018 to court, and then this Jackson's come out the woodwork, and then he was forced to say he'd been to Harry Marshall and done the design, but I know that's rubbish. And he waffles on a bit about Barker Battelle and the company secretary, but none of these, and Bonita Trimmer and all these people, but none of these knew anything about this Warphead design, who designed it, until 2018. As I said, once this Ian Jackson was dragged out of the woodwork by a mystery caller, as he says in his witness statement. He says he had a phone call from a mystery caller, from a friend of his, a designer friend who notified him of the article in the paper, and then he found this Terry Bond. This Terry Bond then rang up Brown Jacobson. But the strange thing about this is that this mystery caller, this friend who rang him once it was in the paper after the throwout trial, nobody mentions him again. Brown Jacobson never brought him to court at the trial. They never actually said, well, okay, was this mystery caller, Mr. Jackson, who notified you? He seems to know all about your business. He seems to know what you've done in the past, because he's rung you and he's obviously had a chinwag with you and warned you of the pending doom that's going to fall upon you. And then we've got, you're then forced to call Mr. Tony Bond, Mr. Terry Bond, let's get it right. Mr. Terry Bond, who then called Brown Jacobson. Mr. Jackson, if you hadn't have been forced to make this phone call, you would never have come forward, as you've never come forward over the years, and spoke about the design. You've never told anyone, have you? You just kept it completely secret to yourself. Right, let's move on from that article. 13. Let's move on to 13. Article 13. Now, in Article 13, we start to get the recollection and the memory loss creeping in, where the judge goes on to say, Ron and I were doing our best to assist the court to the best of our recollection. As you know, I've got a fantastic recollection, and Ron's recollection, I'll explain to you later on, of the events were embedded in his brain through an event. Right, let's move on to 14. 14 is just outlining what actually happened again, which they're trying to say is all lies. So we won't harbour on that anymore. I think I've explained that in previous episodes. The important one, I think, is this one, the 15, which is this one here. This is when Ron came to court as a witness to me designing the logo in 63. When I explained to you earlier on, I was sitting around a table. It had got to be a Saturday afternoon, I would have thought, because I would have been at work otherwise. So it was either a Saturday or a Sunday, but I got this feeling it was a Saturday. Couldn't say the exact day. But what actually happened in this case, the judge goes on to say, I have no reason to doubt his bona fide evidence, which is his truthful evidence, right? But when Ron was on the stand, what the judge doesn't say in this statement is when Ron was on the stand, he was giving evidence and telling them about his story, the story that we all know about. And then this spec, their barrister, said to Ron, I understand you saw your brother Peter write the letter to Wolverhampton Wanderers. Well, Ron stopped and he thought, well, that's rubbish. And he said, well, that's not true. He said, I never saw him write the letter. And then this spec said, well, it says in your statement that you saw him write the letter to Wolverhampton Wanderers. And of course, this unseated Ron, because he knew damn well he hadn't, and I knew he hadn't. And if you look through all the documentation, and they've looked through all the documentation, I can tell you, and this is a first because he never ever stated such a thing to anyone ever, because it's untrue. But they've got to discredit Ron, because Ron's an educated chap. He's got his own business, systems analysis business, basically telling people where they've gone wrong with their businesses and helping them out. I mean, he's got certificates and degrees, BA certificate and degrees. So he's not a stupid man, and he wouldn't have done such a thing. But this is the way this spec worked. He put this in Ron's statement. Well, I mean, we don't know if it was in the statement because it's what he said that was in the statement. What we actually should have done was said, stop the court now, we want to see this statement. But when you're under pressure in court and you're being grilled by this sort of spec bloke who is very clever in the way he goes about things, because he screams and tries to put you under pressure to unseat you, and it did unseat Ron. And it made Ron look indecisive and unsure to the judge. And spec succeeded in doing that by throwing this curved ball at Ron, which was completely untrue. And you can see on the last couple of lines that the impact it made on the judge's opinion of Ron's evidence. It says, these points inevitably reduce the confidence I have in his evidence, and I have approached his evidence with a degree of caution as a result. So there we go. This spec, he goes to discredit Ron in court with his lies. Because there were lies. There's no doubt there were lies. Okay, let's move on to 15. No, let's move on to 16. Well, the judge in this goes on to say, as for Mr. Peter Davies himself, I have to say a little more. Well, Judge, I've got a lot more to say about you, not a little. He goes on to explain about the detailed and skillful cross-examination from Speck. Now, if you call being screamed at by a cockerel who's standing on his one leg constantly for 20 hours, which was 8 hours on the Thursday, around about 8 hours on the Friday, and 3 or 4 hours on the Monday morning. If you call that a skillful examination, it harps back to 1939, 45, when the Nazis were on the scene. They were doing the same thing to our guys over in Germany and such. And if that's what the judge thinks is skillful, he's got seriously something wrong with his head. Right, let's move on to 17. Right, on 17, the judge is well into his game now. This is where he starts using the sheer length of time and my memory and all this sort of thing. And he goes on to state that it's more or less impossible for me to remember the 50 years or to any degree of accuracy of 50 years. And he goes on to state certain cases and quotes about the limitations of human memory. Yeah, but the limitations of some human memories, we're not all the same, Judge, but you seem to point us out as all the same. Some people have got a lot more memory than others, and some people have got no memory at all because they're ill and they've got dementia. But as I explained from my book, I have an impeccable 60-year memory, which narrates my childhood from the age of 4 right up to when I was 20 or 30. So this paragraph here is absolute rubbish. It doesn't apply to me. And to be honest with you, I think this is some sort of loophole in the law, because if my memory is perfect, why should this statement be made? And talking back to Ron's memory was quite brilliant on that day, because I was doing the design, as I said, there was me, Val, Dave sitting around the table. Dave was doing something, Val was doing a jigsaw, and I was doing these designs. And Ron walked in, and I always remember I just still got a big bushy head of hair. And he looked over my shoulder, and I said, "What do you think?" He looked at it disdainfully, thinking, blimey, what a load of rubbish. But he narrated this in the court, and they tried to say, "Oh, you couldn't possibly remember 50 years ago when your brother was sitting around the table," and all this sort of thing. But Ron then piped up that on that particular Friday he'd had his exam results, so he knew more or less the time and the era when it was, more or less exactly the date. Actually, if you looked at his exam results, thinking now, you could probably find the exact day I did the design. But they tried to discredit him on that, saying you couldn't possibly remember all this sort of thing. But he did. And it's like all of us, if we have an event in our lives, even no matter how old we are, if we have an event which is memorable to us, such as a wedding or a funeral, we do remember these things. Okay, let's move on to 18. Okay, in this Article 18, he tries to point out that Mr. Speck, their solicitor, said that my drawing designs varied, they weren't all the same. We're not robots, Mr. Speck. We don't produce a design and then keep hammering it out the same. As I've explained, and as you already knew before you made this statement, Judge, is that the stamp album design was the initial sketches from the idea of the Speedway bib design. If you remember the Speedway bib that I showed you in a photograph of, the basic my wallpaper design came from that, because it was for the Speedway anyway. And then we had the next progression of the design, which is a progression of design, which went on to the Cyril Cowl, which was an idea for my school exams. I thought, I can use this. This is an original idea. I'll use this for my school exams, because they like that sort of thing, originality at school. And then, obviously, we then progressed from that to the round Pascal circle-based design, which is the finished design which I entered the painting competition in with. So we've got 3 stages there. They're not going to be the same. They're all going to be different. And then he goes on to talk about Mishcomderea and the letters. Well, I've actually got that letter, which I'll just go through in the next couple of statements with you. And it's basically balderdash what he's saying here. Also in the 2 videos, he saw the evidence of the construction of the design. You've seen the 2 videos, and I explained in the 2nd video the 3-stage progression of the design. So what's the judge going on about here? Why is he criticising what he already knows to be the truth? Okay, let's move on to 19. Okay, the judge is confused here. Is telling what I know is a lie, because I never said that the design was from the mathematical side of Pascal's theorem, and I never said to Mishcomderea that either in the letter. What I actually said was the design was based on the circle and the 6 points from Pascal's mystical theorem. I'm not a mathematician. I've told them umpteen times. In the videos it's been explained. The judge already knows this, but he's ignoring all these things to justify this statement, statement 19, and to justify the rest of the statements. Right, what I'll do now, I'll just show you the letter. Well, part of the letter to Mishcomderea. Now, as you can see, if you look at the line under the warphead, which is, that warphead is more or less what I explained to Mishcomderea. It's it's more or less what I entered into the painting competition. It's not much different. But if you look at the line underneath, it says, Mr. Davis based his warphead design on Pascal's hexagon-mysticum theorem. Now, the important word there is based. In the Oxford English Dictionary, the definition of the word base is to use an idea reliant on something you saw. Well, it's obvious. When I did the exam and the investigation into Pascal at the library, the only visual thing was the 6 points on a circle, which the judge seems to deny throughout this whole statement, and he harps on the mathematical side of Pascal's theorem, which he knows is absolute rubbish, and it's already been explained to him so many times. I don't want to explain it anymore. So let's just move that out of the way. Let's sort of straighten this again and have a look what else is said in this article 19. Yeah, I'm not going to say too much more about that. I don't think I need to. Right, let's move on to 20. Let's have a look for reference. Yeah, 20. I'll just read it and I'll comment. Okay, this is where